There's an argument atheists make that is common, very common, but at the same time, chances are that you have never heard it unless you are really dialed into these discussions and debates. They argue that the Bible says that God is the creator of evil. You know, like evil didn't exist and then God made it. So who's the bad guy now, huh? Not the devil. The verse in question is Isaiah 45:7, and this response appears all the time in places where such things are discussed. But I don't want to just tell you, I want to really show you.
God beside me. I go to thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west, that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Drop down the heavens from above, and let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open, and let them bring forth salvation, and let righteousness spring up together. I, the Lord, have created it. Woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, what makest thou? All thy work he hath no hands. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Drop down ye heavens from above, and let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open, and let them bring forth salvation, and let righteousness spring up together. I, the Lord, have created it. Woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, what makest thou? All thy work he hath no hand. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, what makest thou?
As is often the case, the people saying this think they are so original and clever, but it's basically an NPC response. So, as you can tell, I don't think very highly of it. But of course, my disdain is not an argument, and it shouldn't by itself convince anyone. So I want to show you why their thinking is wrong. Not only wrong, but dead wrong, even foolish. This is a strong claim, and I think the evidence supports it. Usually I give arguments the benefit of the doubt. Even if I think it's wrong by my analysis, I could see how someone might buy it. There are a lot of ideas out there that are wrong, but which seem right. I might say something like, but maybe I'm wrong, or this is a reasonable question. Not today. There is nothing reasonable about their claim, and those who use it only display their ignorance. To understand why the argument falls apart, all we have to do is understand one simple two-letter word. This is the Hebrew word ra, or ra. Now, many of the words we look at here might be complicated theological words, and there may be uncertainties of meaning, but not so with ra. It is a very simple word. Aleph with Beth is a great channel on YouTube for learning Hebrew, and they currently have over 120 lessons. Ra is covered in lesson 9, alongside other basic concepts like name, brother, and word. This is to say that Ra is not some fancy Bible word like salvation or sanctification. It is a simple, everyday word. Let's watch part of the lesson. Shout out to Aleph with Beth.
Ra. 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 Tov. Ra. Tov. Ra. Tov. David הוא איש טוב. דוד איש טוב. גוליית הוא איש רע. גוליית איש רע. איש טוב, איש רע. ארץ רעה. ארץ רעה. ארץ טובה. ארץ טובה. ארץ רעה. הדבר הזה רע. הטובים הדברים האלה? לא. הדברים האלה רעים. הדברים האלה רעים. הטוב הדבר הזה? לא. הדבר הזה רע מאוד. רע מאוד. שלום.
As we have discussed before on this channel, ancient Hebrew had many fewer words than modern languages. Strong's Concordance has a total of 8,674 Hebrew words. Compare this to English's approximately 170,000 words, almost 20 times more. As a result, words in ancient Hebrew tend to have more uses, and Ra is a perfect example of that. Ra basically means bad in the most broad sense. You saw some of the examples from the video. Bad person, bad land, bad fruit. Bad fruit? What does that mean? What a weird thing to say. Like someone doesn't like pineapple or something? No, rotten fruit is bad. Oh, of course, rotten is bad. Bad fruit. But what is bad land? There are different kinds of land. Are some really better than others? Well, land that can grow food is really useful, especially if that's how you survive. So, in these broad ways, many things were categorized this way in their thinking as good or bad based on their utility. Even in English, we use the same word to describe a bad person and a bad chess move, although they are really quite different concepts. one being morally evil and one being counterproductive with respect to our goal of winning. So, although in English bad can mean moral evil, it doesn't always mean that. Similarly, ra has a broad range of possible meanings. Let's look at some other examples where ra is used in the Bible to get an idea how it might be used in Isaiah 45:7. Firstly, one example that I left out from the Aleph with Beth video. Here it is.
Parot tovot. Parot tovot. Parot raot. Parot raot. Henna tovot. Vehenna raot.
Parot raot. Bad cows. Bad cows? What is that about? It sounds like a bad dairy commercial. This example Beth chose is actually straight out of the Bible and from a part that you're probably familiar with. In Genesis 41, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is telling Joseph about a dream he had. In the dream, 7 beautiful cows came out of the Nile, and then 7 raw cows came out and ate them. This was a prophecy of a famine that was to come. There was something about the cows that was not good. Maybe they were ill. Maybe they were unhealthy or thin. And that is how it is usually translated to us. But whatever the specific issue was with their appearance, they were not the way that cows should be. They were raw cows. But that obviously doesn't mean that they were morally evil or something. But I should acknowledge that out of the 784 times that raw is used in the Bible, most of the time it is talking about moral evil. So there is no shortage of examples of that. But let's look at some other places where raw is clearly not about moral evil. Joseph again. When his brothers sold him down the river, they told their father that a wild beast killed him. Actually, in Hebrew, it is a haya ra'ah, a bad animal. That animal was a bad hombre. In the book of Numbers, they were always complaining about all the hardships of desert life. It says that they were complaining about raw, complaining about the bad. We also have examples of bad water, a bad report, in trouble, and just plain being sad. With all of these examples, I think it is clear that ra does not always and only mean moral evil. So why are the multitudes so confident that it must mean moral evil? Since we know that ra can have multiple meanings, context will be key for determining which one is intended. About Isaiah 45, so Isaiah 45 begins with a prophecy about the Persian king Cyrus, who historians now refer to as Cyrus the Great. This is definitely an interesting discussion in its own right, but God foretells the coming of Cyrus by name about 200 years before he came. And he was a person anointed by God to do great things. So references to I will go before you and I will summon you by name, I will bestow you with the title of honor, and I will strengthen you are referring to Cyrus. And this could be confusing if you begin reading in verse 5. Now, the reason that God has done all these things through Cyrus, from the King James Version, beginning in verse 6, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Drop down, ye heavens from above, and let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open, and let them bring forth salvation. And let righteousness spring up together. I, the Lord, have created it. So the purpose of using Cyrus was to display God's power, that the people of the nations may see and respond accordingly. And in this context of saying that he is God unlike any other, he provides examples of his power. He says that he forms light and creates darkness, that he makes peace and creates Ra. Interestingly, I think the first example is much more unclear than the latter. Is it talking about how God physically formed light in Genesis 1:3? Or is this referring to metaphorical light? Is it saying that he brings good and bad situations where light is a metaphor? I think it is the latter, and that he then restates this principle by saying that he brings peace and Ra. The word translated here as peace is a word you may know, Shalom. A Bible word perhaps, but a common one. Among its other claims to fame, this is probably the most common Hebrew tattoo, one that I have seen a number of times. And for good reason. It has a special status in the Hebrew language, philosophy, and tradition. It is also a pleasant word which has come to be used as a greeting, literally wishing peace on those you encounter. And in this case, it is the key to unlocking the meaning of Ra in this verse. It says that God creates light and darkness, opposites, and then that he creates Shalom and Ra, another set of opposites. Now, if Ra were supposed to mean moral evil here, then we would expect it to be contrasted with moral good. But the presence of Shalom gives it away. The meaning of Ra here must be an opposite of peace. You might say that war is the opposite of peace, but there are other, better options which are within the possible range of definitions. Words like calamity, disaster, trouble, and woe. And you see that many translations use one of these words in their translations rather than translating it as evil. I prefer calamity because I think it captures the chaos that is the antithesis of peace, while also being sufficiently bad to satisfy the demands of Ra. And this idea that God brings calamity is consistent with what we see elsewhere in the Bible. Many places it talks about how God used powerful nations like Assyria and Babylon to inflict judgments on the people. From Isaiah 10, "Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. I send him against a godless nation. I dispatch him against a people who anger me." So calamity makes sense. But what about translations that translate it as evil? Usually the King James Version is mentioned in this context because it is such a popular, classic version which translates this verse as evil. But it looks like this translation actually goes back to the Wycliffe Bible 2 centuries earlier. The Wycliffe Bible was the first complete English translation dating back to the 14th century. So, from the beginning, this was the way it was translated. And this is a common thread which can be seen running through the translations which translate evil. They are mostly old and traditional. Now, I don't want to go so far as taking the strong position that modern translations are just better, but I think that in a situation like this, especially where we have done some analysis, it is appropriate to point to some factors. Once a translation has been made, there can be a hesitancy to move away from it. In my lifetime, I've seen people disgruntled about new Bible translations for changing the Bible without really knowing the underlying reasoning. For them, it is simple. It used to say X, and now you are making it say Y. You are breaking our tradition. And as Christians, we can be too tied to tradition. I also don't want to say that all criticisms of modern translations are unjustified, but many of the changes by modern translators are for good reason. And even now, Bible translators do take into consideration what is the traditional wording of verses and will go out of their way to preserve that wording in critical passages so long as the meaning is close enough. And in a similar way, anything that was in the King James Bible was sticky and slow to change. There are even some today who take this to a whole other level by saying that the King James Bible is the only reliable translation. They're called King James Onlyists, and in my opinion, their love of tradition clouds their judgment. So those who insist that Isaiah 45:7 says that God created evil, not only are they just choosing a translation, they're choosing the least viable one. So we saw examples of how Ra can have different meanings. We saw how the context of the verse indicates a definition that is opposite of peace. And we saw how the only argument for translating this passage as evil comes from traditional translations. So what about the Wycliffe translation? Why did it translate this verse as peace and evil in the first place? This is a little speculation on my part, but I actually think that when the Wycliffe Bible was translated in the 14th century, evil was a more appropriate translation than it is today. This is because I think that in the past, the word evil was used more broadly than it is nowadays. If you look at the current definitions of evil on dictionary.com, you will see that a number of these are dedicated to the concept of harm. Notice how the definition also includes the familiar synonyms of woe, calamity, and disaster. But it is unusual for us to speak in that way anymore. We tend to use bad as the flexible word and restrict evil to discussions of moral evil. As an example of this, there is currently a disagreement in philosophy about whether we should be calling natural disasters like tornadoes and earthquakes natural evil at all, because they are not, strictly speaking, evil. At least not in the way we tend to use it now. To some extent, I think this specialization of words is a natural process, and I have no complaints about how our language is changing. The problem is when we, out of our own ignorance, start pointing the finger at King James, or more problematically, at God. It really is profoundly foolish. And I hope, now that you understand all the linguistic considerations, that this is clear to you as well. I recently talked with someone who really didn't believe the Bible, but he was very personable and he wanted to talk about it. Somewhere in the middle of our long conversation, he brought up Isaiah 45:7. Imagine my surprise to encounter this internet atheist argument in the wild. He said that he liked to point the verse out to Christians to show them how little they know. Actually, he had a very low opinion of Isaiah, and he didn't think too highly of those that like the book either. As we discussed the verse, he stated very clearly that he didn't care what Isaiah meant, the intended meaning of the text. He just found this as a useful tactic to put people in their place. It isn't like he believed the Bible anyway. This was startling to me when he said it. Even if Isaiah isn't speaking for God, it should be important what he meant by what he was saying. Otherwise, you're misrepresenting him. What we would call a straw man argument. I appreciate his honesty, and it did open my eyes to some issues. Someone may say this or that, but you don't really know their heart or intentions. Maybe they're just wanting to rattle your cage, or bring you down a peg, or insult God. We take everything at face value and try to offer precise answers, but they may not really care at the end of the day whether the Bible says that God created evil.